Marketing's goal is to build the business in many ways. It's not about opens or tracking who clicked on an email. It's about driving engagement, driving brand recognition, driving people to the sales team. Like, we're trying to accomplish something.
You're listening to Content Logistics, a podcast for B2B marketers where we explore the foundational and sometimes frustrating elements of content. We're talking to the experts, learning all their tips and tricks. We don't gatekeep here. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to another episode of Content Logistics. I'm your host, Bailey Gunnell, and today we're going to talk about why email metrics are lying to you and what metrics you should be tracking instead. With email tracking becoming incredibly unreliable due to privacy changes and evolving spam filters, marketers really need to rethink how they measure this engagement. I have an expert in this area, Jacob Brain. He's the director of operations at Marketers in Demand, and he has a really unique and fantastic approach to how to address this and has some great ideas on how we can rethink this as well. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into it. Jacob, welcome to the show. I'm so happy to have you here. We got a really great topic, but let's just get right into it, starting with the big picture. Why are open and click tracking no longer reliable when it comes to email marketing?
I think it helps to start with like an understanding of how it works in the first place. So from a technical standpoint, without getting too far into the weeds, just at a high level, open tracking, the way it works is a tiny little pixel, so like a 1x1 pixel image, is added to an email that we send. So whenever you send an email that's tracked, whether it's a newsletter, a cold email, or even in your own inbox, if you have an email tracking tool, there's going to be somewhere in that email you send a little 1x1 white pixel that no one even knows is there. And what happens is when that pixel is fired, or the image for that pixel is pulled from a server, that's a trigger that someone opened it, because that image was recalled, essentially. Just like you would open up a web page and have like a header image pulled in. Well, that image is coming from somewhere. And so when that server sends that image, that's an indicator that someone opened, because it wouldn't have been called if no one opened the email. So that's how open works, at least at a basic high level. Clicks work a little bit differently. And so clicks, typically, there's a couple different ways to do it, but usually they will work by a tracking URL. So if you're trying to send somebody to website.com, when you put your content and your links in your tool that you're using for, let's say it's a newsletter or something, what it will do automatically behind the scenes is it's going to change that URL to something else. And so if you get a newsletter in your inbox and you hover over links from that, you'll actually see they're like weird links. So different tools will have different domains they use to track this stuff. And what happens is when I click on this, let's say it's like a HubSpot, I don't remember what their domain is, like hs.com/ a bunch of random numbers, that will redirect to that website.com that you wanted to send them to. And so because there's that redirect, again, the server can tell that this exact person clicked on this exact link, and the person just got forwarded right to that, but that tracking URL allowed for that trigger to happen. So opens, tiny image, clicks is a forwarding URL usually. And so what's happened is, back in the day, that worked fine. Email clients didn't really care. They would get the email, you click on it, forward it, email open, all good. Over time, a couple things changed. So some of them are around like privacy, and some of them are around spam, as that problem's gotten worse over the years. And so there's a couple like bigger changes. So like Apple's mail privacy protection, they like preload a lot of the images in emails. And they do that for user experience to speed things up. But what happens if you're preloading the images in an email that you haven't opened yet, that's going to fire that open. And so if you send emails to a bunch of people using Apple Mail or whatever it's called, they're all going to look like they opened it, when in reality they didn't, just because that preloading is happening. So like how email clients are managing email, as they should be prioritizing user experience and the end user and things, causes some issues on the technical side of tracking. So that's one element. There's some image caching. VPNs are becoming more popular, which can cause problems as well. But the other big one is spam filters. And so one thing that spam filters will often do is when you get an email, they're going to go through that email. They're going to say, are there any sketchy links in here, or sketchy images or information that like indicates that this is spam? Again, this is done for a good reason. We don't want to get caught paying Nigerian princes a bunch of money, or the whole classic, whatever.
Yeah.
And so as they're doing that, it's triggering a bunch of false clicks. And so because of that and a variety of other things, click tracking and open tracking specifically have become much less reliable of a success indicator, I guess you could say. They're not useless, but it's not a really good success indicator. So that's at a high level, at least, how they work and why some of those changes are impacting some of the metrics that we see.
Yeah. And this impacts pretty much everyone. Who doesn't send emails? Who isn't trying to track their email clicks and things like that? But I think what I'm really excited to get into in a minute is how you can kind of get around this. But I want to go back to about talking about the forwarding URLs. Is that the same thing as a UTM parameter, or are they different?
They are used in tandem. So usually what'll happen is, let's say we're sending people to example.com and we're sending from, I don't know, we'll say HubSpot in this example. What HubSpot will do is they will replace the domain of that. So they'll actually send people to, again, I don't remember exactly what it is, but like hs.com. And then they'll add UTM parameters to that. And so they'll use, essentially to a human, it's just a bunch of random characters, but it's an ID for that exact link with that exact user. And so they then, in their own internal systems, can map everything. So it's more like they send that through to that other domain and they have a big ID. And that ID knows like who you are, what link you clicked, and all of that. So it's kind of a matching thing that's happening behind the scenes. But it's very similar to the functionality of a UTM parameter.
Yeah, that is very cool. This is why I have you on the show, Jacob, because you're a very great technical marketer, and this is an area I am still growing in a lot.
Well, it's interesting because I think as we press forward, not only in email marketing, but everything, like every marketer has to be kind of technical. And I don't mean that you need to be a developer or understand I'm not a guru of this by any means. I just know enough to do the job, essentially. But as we go on, the more complicated the technology, the more technology available, the knowledge about that stuff not only helps answer questions like this of why does open and click tracking not work the way it used to, but it also allows us to know what's possible from a strategic standpoint. So it's just an interesting, evolving kind of thing to watch in the marketing world.
Yeah, that is super interesting. So one thing, I know we're going to get into solutions on how to get around this, but just the way things are right now, your data isn't necessarily useless. It's maybe just not the most reliable. So I know you can tracking individual opens and clicks is not reliable, but you can compare it across data. So one email from the next. Do you mind diving into that a little bit more?
Click tracking and open tracking are consistently unreliable. And what I mean by that is if you're sending to the same 1,000 people every time, well, people aren't changing mail providers very often. They're not usually adding extra spam filters and things. So because of that, while inaccurate, it's still an accurate representation of trends. And so what I mean by that is if you're sending a newsletter to the same 1,000 people every single month, you're going to get a certain open rate and click-through rate that is much higher than reality. Let's say you get a 70% open rate. Well, I can be pretty confident you didn't actually get a 70% open rate. But if next time you send, you get a 50% open rate, that's actually a useful piece of data. So the delta between the two is not a useless piece of information, but it's not I wouldn't go so far to say it's the individuals that clicked actually clicked. So it's like a trend. So how you use the data just needs to change. Now, the other thing I didn't mention earlier that's also worth keeping in mind is our conversation so far has been around just straight technical tracking. That is good, but is not the most important. And so we've even been using a lot of newsletter examples. On the cold email side of things, one of the biggest things you need to focus on is deliverability. And these spam filters are getting tighter and tighter and tighter over time. And again, I say all these things not to knock on spam filters or mail providers or anything, because they're prioritizing correctly. As these tools that have come out, AI, things like that, have allowed more accessible and higher scale email sending, spam has become a much bigger problem. So they've needed to tighten things up. Well, one of the indicators of spam is sending traffic to a link that's not the one that you show on the link. So as an example, if you're saying let's go to website.com and the spam filter says, oh, it's actually going to hsz.com/whatever, it's going to be It could be tracking, or it could be some spam site. I don't know. And so it has ways to differentiate between the two. But I bring this up because in many cases, if we're doing like cold DMI or something, I might not even track opens and clicks because the data is somewhat useful in comparing, but it's that usefulness is far less valuable than how I would prioritize deliverability in the first place. And so again, we're focusing on the tracking element in this conversation, but it is important to keep in mind that you don't want to get somewhat useful data at the cost of like results.
Just to summarize what you're saying, I think it's important that most people, it's probably best just to turn off your open tracking and maybe the click tracking too, so you don't get spam.
Even then, it depends on the context. So like if I am sending a newsletter to my clients, I might keep open and click tracking on because they have signed up for the newsletter explicitly. They're probably more engaged with it, more interested in it. And so because of that, I'm not quite as worried about it. It's something I want to keep in mind and look at it. Whereas on the other end, if I'm doing a straight, like trying to get a GTM campaign up going, company, startup, never done anything more essentially, and we're trying to just get our feet in somewhere, well, these people are in a different position. And so I'm going to be really, really careful about the deliverability side of things.
Yeah, that's great. So I think now let's get into the fun part. What should people be tracking instead? How, like, what metrics are important and how can we kind of get around the changes that have been happening?
There might be something, but I am unaware of any way to really get around to click tracking. So there's no like a quick fix to it. There might be some things you can try, and there's a whole host of tricks to make that work a little bit better. But at the end of the day, you're kind of fighting an uphill battle. So the approach I take is you can see the direction that these technologies are going. Filters are getting tighter. Like I don't see us loosening the spam filter tightness or pulling back on privacy regulations and things like that. And so instead of fighting that uphill battle, I often want to just like look somewhere else for useful data. And so while these privacy and spam filter changes and trends have been happening, simultaneously, we're getting some really amazing technology that allows us to get a lot of other information. And so just to provide an example, there's tools like one really hot one, but definitely like a couple of months ago, a year ago, was RB2B, where you can track individual users that landed on your site. There are tools like Factors that track individual companies that come on the site. And these tools weren't available historically. And so things like open and click tracking, it really was all you had. And so now that we're getting these technologies that allow us different types of information and different ways to validate the performance of various campaigns that we're running, it's like we lose one here and we gain some over here. And I think in many cases, these changes, they force us out of fixed habits that we never questioned. Like there's a lot to be said at the end of the day about like, who cares if someone opens your email, if they're not replying or becoming a client at some point. It is that's where marketers get into trouble around like vanity metrics. And so it is useful because you can optimize around it, but is it the most useful thing? I think maybe we can over rely on that. And so when changes like this happen, I think it's important as a marketer to take a step back, kind of ask questions that we wouldn't have asked before around what are we really trying to accomplish here? So again, you're losing some of those, but you're gaining in others. And so we'll dive into it really, but you can see a lot of data around who came to your website, where they came from, what they did on the website, how they interacted with other campaigns that you had kind of running in collaboration with the email campaigns. And so you have all of this other data. I would argue that the story behind what a user is doing in kind of the different data points that you can see across campaigns, I would rather see that story than know that they clicked on an email. In many cases, it's a more robust data set to make decisions off of.
Because sometimes you can get pigeonholed into thinking, hey, email maybe is everything, where the real value is who's maybe spending time on your website, who is interacting with your content on LinkedIn, who's interacting with your ads, and you can see the bigger picture of what's going on rather than just being siloed into a single system, which could be email, but seeing the whole picture.
Definitely. And it's interesting because you have, people on LinkedIn, those people, they'll say things like email is dead. And they're saying that because they can't track a couple data points. That is so not true. Like email has been one of the highest ROI channels for many, many, many marketing teams for many, many, many years. Email is still a really good tool. I mean, I think 2 weeks ago, signed up to something I got. Like that legitimately happens when the message right, and there's a whole other conversation there. But it's not dead because we can't track something. I think people just give up sometimes. And they're like, oh, well, if I can't look at those metrics I looked at for the last 5 years, 10 years, I guess it's all useless.
Yeah, definitely not dead, just a different approach to it. So there's lots of ways that marketers can get around getting this bigger picture of data. And one thing we're doing at Marketers in Demand that I'm really excited about is the TAM manager. So I think we could maybe talk about how we're solving this problem, but there's also so many other ways that other marketers can solve this problem too. But do you mind just explaining a little bit what the TAM manager is and kind of how it gets around this data?
Yeah. So a while back, we were running into the same problem that we're talking about now. These metrics over here aren't working. We have a lot of other information that's really valuable. How do we respond to this? And this is really a conversation around a company's approach to their marketing data. And so the route we took is we built something that we called the TAM manager, which stands for the Total Addressable Market Manager. We call it TAM because that is a mouthful to say. But the idea behind the TAM manager is I want to create a database that has as much information around the way that our TAM has interacted with our marketing campaigns, our website, whatever we're pushing out there. And the idea is that a CRM is really good once there's like a deeper engagement or a conversation going, but it's not really built, it's not really structured in a way that was, number one, affordable, but just makes sense for addressing a lot of those data points. And so just like in a CRM, to use that example, if you have a solid marketing team that's doing marketing operations in this way, is if a salesperson's been having a conversation with someone, they can click on that person and see all of the activity they've done, the emails they've sent, the conversations back and forth, them visiting a website, things like that. And so that concept, we're kind of pooling to a way, way higher in the funnel. And so we're saying, well, I already know my TAM. So for some like really tightly targeted niche B2B companies, like high consideration purchases, they might have 500 or 1,000 potential customers based on their product. And so when that happens, or even when it's bigger than that, we know who the market is. We have a pretty good idea. We can use tools like Clay to pull not only company names, but individuals on the buying groups for these people. And so we have that understanding, and we're sending marketing out, some of which is individually based targeting like ABM campaigns, some of which is using more attribute based targeting like various paid campaigns or Google ads or something. And so we're doing all of this stuff. And the idea is, well, if we're losing a little bit of this data, it becomes more important to lean on the newly available data that I was mentioning earlier through tools like RV2B and Factors. So what we did is we set up a database, and we're tracking a couple different things. Number one is we're tracking, or I guess we'll say we're doing a couple things. Number one is data collection. And so we're sending emails, we have paid campaigns running, we're doing LinkedIn DMs, whatever campaigns we're doing. Those are triggering events and engagements with our target market. So we're collecting all that data, pulling the data from there's outside tools that we're using into a central database. So data collection. Step two that we're doing is we're managing that data. So we're connecting all of the different events that happen across our marketing campaigns with contacts, associating those contacts with companies. And that allows us to build a really robust data set of here are all the companies that we've been targeting. Here are the companies we've touched with various marketing campaigns, what they've done. On a contact level, what campaigns have interacted with, what emails were they sent, what LinkedIn DMs were they sent, what paid campaigns did they interact with, did they come to the site and perform certain activities? We can trigger that. And so we can see this contact level, and then I kind of mentioned this already, the event level. So we're pulling all this information in, we're correlating this information with each other, and that allows us to have, just like you would have in a CRM with like your prospects that you're talking to, a really robust data set of information around who's engaging and who is not. And when you have a really high consideration type of product or really expensive product, especially in the B2B side of things, the buying cycles for these can be extraordinarily long. Someone might have done weeks of research in your product, but never reached out. Well, we're able to see this information, and just to provide like an example, like we would know, let's say like 3 people from a target account had 2 or more, 3 or more sessions on our website. One of those downloaded a resource from the website. Across all of them, there were 12 clicks on the LinkedIn ad campaign that we're running, whatever that might be. They, at that point, like I guess that one person downloaded an ebook, but besides that, they've not reached out and asked for anything. Our sales team is probably not connecting with them, but there is a lot of engagement happening, and I want the sales team to be reaching out to them. So by collecting, managing, and kind of reviewing this data, we can then set up triggers from this. And we can do like a common model for this is like a lead scoring type of thing that a lot of CRMs will do. And we're going to say, hey, well, if these people have kind of as a whole in this account have done these 5 things, then we want our sales team to reach out and just kind of call them or whatever. So that'll essentially this idea of a TAM manager, just this approach to data management allows us to, while we lose things like click and opens many cases, we can really see a much more robust data set and have a much better conversation with sales team members too. There's the common like marketing sales friction that exists. And if a marketing team is really collecting all this information, and let's say it's like a very sales-led organization where there's a lot of cold calls happening, for example. Well, instead of having a list of people to call, we can say, hey, here are a list of companies and contacts that we know have engaged with the campaigns. Here's how they've engaged. And there's a really good conversation that can come from that. And there's a familiarity that comes from that instead of, the new age version of opening up the phone book and starting to call top to bottom sort of thing. Now, that doesn't actually happen, but you know what I mean? People do a kind of cold calling approaches like that, and this helps optimize it.
Yeah. I think that's so smart to like pull from multiple sources to get a better idea of how engaged a prospect would be rather than solely relying on email or solely relying on paid media. We have multiple platforms where we're trying to connect with prospects, and being able to use that for a sales team is so much better than just cold calling or anything else they might be doing.
Yeah, and it just all comes back to like telling the story, and all of that can be modified. Like maybe we figure out we want more engagement before sending to sales. Maybe we feel like we missed an opportunity because I went with the competitor when we could have reached out, so we lower the bar. Like all of this is manipulatable because you own this data set. And it does sound very complex, and it is somewhat technical, but the idea is like the modern tech stack needs to have some version of this, right? To have all that data broken apart makes it really hard to tell stories. It makes it hard to kind of trigger when people are actually interested, especially in high consideration purchases. So anyway, we call it the TAM manager. Anyone can call it whatever they want. They can do whatever they want. But the idea is it's just very valuable to have that central repository so you can see that. And there are tools that do versions of this too without needing to build a more custom stack like what I'm talking about.
I know you've mentioned several tools. I've used a lot of these tools, but I think for people who are listening, who are hearing you throw out Clay and Factors and all these names, do you mind just explaining what each of these tools are and what they do?
Yeah. So there's probably a couple layers to this. So I'll note some of the ones that are kind of my go-to. I know at Marketers November, we're testing tools. Actually today, I was cleaning up our MarTech list because we have so many tools we're testing at the same time. They're just coming out so fast. But there's maybe a couple different layers. So layer number 1 is what I mentioned earlier, like the events that are happening. And so those events are often triggered at the edge, if you will, of your marketing stack. And so it's tools like maybe you're doing cold emails and you're using like Lemlist or HeyReach or Apollo or something like that. There's that like engagement happens within those tools with your prospects. You then have tools on the paid side, like LinkedIn is a really big one. So you have this like edge case sort of tool set. And those are the common tools that everyone is doing something there, depending on the channel they're doing. But they have some sort of tool set where they're using to actually have that kind of edge case engagement. But there's a newer layer, not even that new necessarily anymore, because it's been around for a couple of years, of more kind of like a deeper layer to the stack. And so this is where you get into tools like RB2B. So if you haven't heard about it, definitely look it up. RB2B is a tool that watches your website. And what it does is it can identify individual contacts or people that have landed on your site, and we could dive into that if it's valuable. Factors is a tool, and Leadfeeder is a tool that do something very similar. Factors focuses more on the company level, and so it does that matching to say, hey, ABC company came to your site instead of Josh came to your site from ABC company. So it's just a different layer of data to see there. But when you do things like that, because of all the data available on the browser, when ABC company comes to your site, you can see where they came from, what the individuals were doing on the website. And some of this is anonymized, and a lot of it is anonymized, although these tools are getting really good kind of de-anonymizing it. But it's still valuable to know that somebody from ABC company visited the site. And the nice part about that is when you have your TAM set up, you're running campaigns to a specific list of people, even if it's all anonymous, you can still have ABC company on your list that you started reaching out to. And when you sent those emails and read those ran those paid campaigns, they landed on your site. If you know nothing else, you know that they were engaging with it. And it gets around, actually, in many ways, I'm kind of rambling here, but it gets away around some of the challenges with like traditional email marketing where you'd send an email to someone and then they'd Google you. And then you're like, I don't know, I sent an email and then 2 minutes later we got a lead. It feels like an email lead, but then sales team is saying it's theirs. And so there's this whole argument. But with tools like this, you're able to track that stuff that you've always been able to around source, but also just match that data across kind of what you're seeing on your site with where your internal database says. So there's those kind of tracking tools. And then maybe the glue to all of this is where tools like Zapier or Make or N8N or NAN, I don't know what people call it, they'll use these integration tools to connect all these data points. And so I think even as I've been talking or when I talk to this about people, a lot of the times they're like, that sounds great. I do not have a full-time developer doing nothing, sitting around waiting to help me with this. And it is nice to have that. But if you don't, a lot of these tools like Zapier will just natively connect to a Smart Lead or whatever. You can use webhooks within Smart Lead specifically to kind of pull that data without needing to write any JSON or anything like that. And so that's maybe one piece. And the last thing I would say is actually when you know your approach to data management, you can select tools in alignment with that philosophy. And so when I'm looking for a tool, I really highly prioritize their API, whether or not they have webhook functionality. And I'll prioritize that way above, in many cases, like a UX. Because UX is nice, but some of the functions like a really solid API will allow me to do way more things. And so like a lot of people are prioritizing this when they're doing things like with a Clay. So there are tools that I use on a daily basis that, except for when I bought it, I have never logged in because they're just like connected to my infrastructure, in that case, Clay or another tool, or maybe through like a Make or N8N or something like that. But there's a bunch of information, I guess, native tools on the edge. You have internal tools for deeper tracking and de-anonymization, and then you have the glue around a lot of those integrations and stuff that you do.
Yeah. I want to go back to one thing you said about kind of like last touch attribution. I feel like this is a really hot topic and people are really upset about this. But I feel like if you use a tool like this that tells the story of, okay, this person clicked an email, but maybe it was that organic search that is where they filled out the form. It really just tells a better story of this journey that someone went on before they filled out the form.
Yeah, and that like first touch, last touch, all the customized in between, it is a really hot topic and one that people get into reasonable, frankly, arguments about, because if a marketing team is being tracked by their ability to drive leads from specifically a paid campaign they're running, otherwise they have to shut it down, they're going to fight for everything and they're going to care about first or last touch depending on what the campaign is doing. But the nice thing, to your point, is when you use a tool like this, you can just get more nuanced in how you track things like that. So you have that story, you have, hey, maybe in some cases you don't know where they came from, but I know they did engage with this paid campaign. So it was a marketing influenced lead at the very least, or we fed that lead to sales and sales closed it. And so there's a lot of other things I have to say around like that side of things. And it really comes down to setting appropriate goals for your teams and aligning interests across your revenue team. But yeah, all of that said, I totally agree with you.
What are some ways I'm thinking about our listeners, and maybe some might be a little overwhelmed right now thinking there's like so much to do. What would maybe be an easy way for them to like start tackling this issue?
Yeah, no, so that's a great question. So my go-to tool, I'm a big fan, is Factors. And so if you're looking to start somewhere and you're like, I can't build a kind of a custom data stack, I don't want to spin up a big query, I've never used Airtable before, whatever it is, I've never used these integration tools. A good first step would just be to log into, it's factors.io, I think it is. And they're not wildly expensive for what they do. They're an incredibly amazing deal. But on even their lowest plans, you can create a user. I would even pull the salespeople into this, get them kind of bought into this idea. And you can start setting up lists. And you can say, hey, I want to see every company that has come from a paid campaign we're doing. I want to see every company that's come organically. I want to see this industry breakout. So it's collecting so much information, and Factors does a big swath of a lot of the data points I was talking about before, that you can get from a 0 to a 1 in a couple hours work, installing Factors on your site, configuring some of the segments is what they call them, and pulling a salesperson in and just being like, look at this. Isn't this cool? This person's been on the site. They're really hot. Got to check them out. Like, or the salesperson jumps in and they're like, oh, I had a conversation with that company 6 months ago and they went a different direction, but a bunch of them are coming to the site now. I'm going to reach out to my contact there. And so using a tool, I'll just say start with Factors. It's my favorite for a variety of reasons, some of which are technical and some of which are just a really solid UX and good tool. But start there, set it up, play around with it, and just engage with your sales team in the potential of this. And I think from there, you can get more complicated. But like a 0 to 1 would be just using a tool like that to kind of see the potential of a lot of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, man, we need to get Factors to sponsor us. The number of clients we've gotten.
I talk about Factors all the time. They're very good. They have an awesome, best support team I've ever worked with. They are spectacular across the board. Big fan. I need to get like a referral link.
They're great. I really love their platform too. I recently learned too that you can track your Google keywords or your pay-per-click keyword, see exactly the keyword that a company clicked on, and then use that later to retarget, and that can really, I think, inform a lot of your campaigns.
Yeah, not to be a fanboy, but they have a really cool LinkedIn connection to pay a little bit more for some of the deeper things where you can see what companies clicked, what companies viewed, a bunch of data around the LinkedIn campaigns. You can integrate it to like CRMs like HubSpot. So actually you can feed that data into HubSpot, and in your kind of, I guess, whatever is your contact view, you can see all the activity for companies and contacts. It is a great deal. I think it's like up there with Factors and Clay are like some of the top in my mind, like they're not new, a couple years old tools that are doing some really amazing things on this side of the marketing conversation.
We're kind of coming up on time, but I think I want to just summarize kind of what we've talked about. But what would you say is like the biggest mindset shift that marketers need to make when it comes to email engagement?
I think being knowledgeable about this trend will lead people to doing one of two things. Either they just give up and they're like, I don't know how this stuff works. It's really technical. I guess we'll just try a different channel sort of thing. I get where people like that are coming from, but I think as like the world is changing rapidly as marketers, and if our approach is to just give up on a certain channel because we kind of are intimidated by the next step of what it could be, I think we'll just be putting ourselves in a tough spot. And I've seen a lot of people talking like this around like LinkedIn and stuff, which I think is really healthy. It's like, this is the reality. Here are some really cool new opportunities we can jump in because of this. And let's just test and try things and figure out what works. And so I think it's really an attitude thing. Like, yes, click and open tracking is not going to get any better anytime soon, but here's what is getting better. Here's what the industry is going, and here's some cool things I can do with that.
There's so much cool stuff coming out. The rules are changing every day, but technology, I feel like, is moving just as fast,
if not faster.
It's not fast.
The one thing I will say, actually, that is important to remember too, is when we're having conversations like this, they get really, really nitty gritty. But at the end of the day, we need to remember what we're trying to accomplish. Like, marketing's goal is to build the business in many ways. There's a famous quote by someone, I forget what it is, who said it. Well, maybe add it in comments somewhere, but that there's two functions of business. There's innovation and there's marketing. And so I think we need to just remember that from a marketing standpoint, and remember that like, it's not about opens or tracking who clicked on an email. It's about driving engagement, driving brand recognition, driving people to the sales team. Like, we're trying to accomplish something, and different marketing departments have different roles within their companies depending on their structured. But like, let's just pull our heads out of that, I think, in many ways, and keep it at a high level, make sure that we're aligning our interests with the business overall, and not politicking it, right? Just making sure that we're aligned with the business is, I think, the thing just to keep in mind.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think sometimes we get really focused on the number of YouTube views they get, or the number or whatever they're ranking on with organically some certain keywords. And that can really, I mean, it's vanity metrics. It's not necessarily driving growth or getting people, building a community.
Certainly.
Great. Well, I got 2 more questions. These are fun, quick ones for you. Real quick, Jacob. But what is your biggest content marketing ick? It can be related to what we've been talking about or totally different.
I have a lot of pet peeves. I think the one right now, yesterday, this one hit me, is I cannot stand when people make like posts or have conversations about like I found AI written content. Like I can tell, I always know they used an M dash or they wrote above a second grade, reading level. So it's AI. It's such an interesting, like I'd have never understood the purpose. Like, congratulations, you found bad content. I could scroll down 3 posts and find other bad content that was probably not written by AI. And I'm not going to make a post about that bad content. It's just such an interesting, I just don't understand the purpose of it. Like, why did you feel the need to make a post about that or even mention it? Like, bad content is a lot of content, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's funny. I have one client, they recently published a new website and people were so mad that they used like AI generated images on their website. Anyway, yeah.
It's
We're gonna have a whole
interesting.
conversation about that. It is. We're in a new world. Things have changed so fast.
Yes.
Okay, and then where can people go to learn more about you, Jacob?
I think probably 2 places. The first one is just to go to marketersindemand.com. We're building several different agencies that are doing some really, really cool work. Kind of what we talked about today is just a tiny piece of it. And so if you want to learn about any of that, please do that. Join our newsletter. We have some good stuff going out there, really about conversations like this. And just me personally, I guess follow me on LinkedIn. I make posts periodically. I wish I made more, but I just think out loud there. I think writing is important for information processing. So anyway, that'd be the second place.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jacob, for joining the show today. I really enjoyed this conversation and I'm excited to share with everyone else.
Love it. Awesome. It's great to be here. I appreciate it, Bailey.
Great. We'll see you. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Content Logistics. Make sure to subscribe to the show so you don't miss the next episode. Bye.